Hey, how's it going everyone? This is YLAM here. In today's video, I want to talk about the X-T3 and how you can very quickly start recording video. This is definitely a run and gun setup, or somebody who's just got their X-T3 and just wants to get started recording video. This is not a more professional setup, in which case there's definitely going to be a lot more work ahead of time. This is designed specifically for people who just want to get started recording video. Very good for YouTube and also very good for quick setup and quick breakdown. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So before we jump into actually using the camera, what I want to do is I want to show you the setup of the camera. This is actually specifically set up to be used in the studio because I don't carry it around with me on a daily basis anymore. But I love this setup when I'm actually making YouTube videos in the studio. So as you can see from the knob, exposure compensation is at 0. I have auto for my shutter and I also have auto for my ISO. On the camera itself, I have aperture set to manual, so this is basically aperture priority. I have image stabilization turned on. I took off the door so that's easier to access the points. One of the reasons for that is because you will definitely want to use the mic jack for your microphone. And also, I definitely recommend using external power. One of the Anker batteries is going to be super useful for the setup, as anytime I actually use this camera inside the studio, I have it connected up to my Anker battery. Now that we've talked about the dials, I want to go ahead and dive into the menus to show you a couple of really important settings. So if you go into menus and dials on the wrench, what I want to show you all the way at the bottom is that for area focus lock, I have that on the switch setting, which is going to be very useful. And then white balance, I also have that on a switch. Also, down at the bottom for power management, for auto shut off, I actually have that off because this is my dedicated studio camera and I don't want it turning off, so I actually have it off. This is another reason why I use the Anker batteries, because I don't want the camera shutting off on me. In terms of performance, I don't need it in boost mode. It's fine just in normal mode. And plus, it'll actually reduce heat because it's not in boost mode. And the last thing to talk about is that anytime I'm actually recording, I have the screen flipped out like this, so the back of the camera is exposed to the air, so that as it generates heat, it can actually get rid of the heat because the back of it is exposed. So it's really important to keep the LCD screen away from the back of the camera. Remember that I had my ISO set to auto. I also had my shutter set to auto. So all of these are actually determined by the camera, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. It definitely lets you speed things up, but you also want to have a little bit of control. So at this point, this is where I actually start locking things down. The first thing that I'm going to look at, based on my lighting condition, I'm going to go into my settings, and the first thing that I want to adjust is my white balance here in my settings. And I would always recommend just going with the Kelvin temperature and then setting it to a color temperature that you like. I usually like around 5,000 if I'm using studio lights, but we can definitely go for a cooler look if you wanted to, or if you want a warmer look, you can go into the higher numbers, and you can go up really high, but around 5,000 will give you a nice white setting. That's what I set it to. Once you have your white balance set to what you like, that'll be good. It will never change because you have it set at a Kelvin setting. The next thing we're going to go ahead and look at is locking down our ISO and also our shutter. Now I have both of them set on auto, and you would think that I wouldn't be able to lock it down. This is where the auto exposure, if I go ahead and I select this, what you'll see down here is that it went ahead and locked my exposure settings. What this means is that if the setting gets really dark and light, the exposure settings wouldn't change. So let me go ahead and shut off the auto exposure lock. So you'll notice down here the exposure lock is gone. If I go ahead and make the scene really dark and then I take it away, what you'll notice is that the exposure changes because the camera is trying to adjust for it. So when I actually have it locked like this, if I go ahead and make it really dark and then I take it away, you'll notice that the exposure doesn't change. This is something that's super useful when you're making YouTube videos, because a lot of times you'll be reaching across and then the scene gets a little bit dark, and then all of a sudden your camera tries to adjust for that exposure, and then it has a really tough time. So having exposure lock is super useful. Now, when you do exposure lock, you still have the ability to use your exposure compensation dial to darken the scene if you really want to. You'll notice that the zebras are starting to go away as I start to darken the scene. So this is something that's super useful because you haven't changed your overall exposure. That's already locked in. but you can use your exposure compensation to actually adjust the overall lighting very easily. This is one of the reasons why the X-T3 is really great studio shooter, even over the X-H1, just because you have all of these manual dials, which is what you really need when you actually want to lock in the picture. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the autofocus lock button. This is going to be super useful to you in two different settings. So what you'll notice right now is that I have focus peaking on. So if I go ahead and go into the menus, and if I scroll down through this menu system, which has quite a lot of things, you'll notice that on manual focus, I have peaking set to red high. So in other words, anything that's actually in focus has this red cast around the edges of it, showing the contrast lines. This is something that's super useful because when I'm doing these type of YouTube videos, I always like to be in manual focus. And the reason for that is because that gives me ultimate control on, what the focus motor is doing. I really don't want to get the focus motor sound on my video recording, so I'm very hesitant on using autofocus, especially when I don't have to. So in this particular case, what I can do is I can use this button to cause a single focus action to occur. So you'll notice that that turned green, which means now it's perfectly in focus. So I can actually activate autofocus simply by pushing this button, even though this camera is set on manual focus. So that's something that's super important to know. You don't actually have to go to the lens and manually dial in your focus. You can actually just hit this button and it'll get you focus. Now, for those of you who don't want to deal with manual focus, which I completely understand, but I do highly encourage you to learn how to use manual focus. If you do want to use continuous autofocus, which is AFC right here, I understand that, but the AF lock button definitely will come in very useful for you, in which when you turn it on, what you'll notice that the AF lock button will turn on. And what this does is that this will now not focus in on my hand because you have locked focus onto this camera. So what you'll see here is that if I turn it off, it'll automatically focus in on my hand. So now it's focused in on my hand. I can lock it, and what you'll notice is that this is not in focus right now. I don't have exposure lock on. I can actually turn on exposure lock. If I do that, what you can see is that my hand is perfectly in focus. And if I turn off autofocus lock, this is now perfectly in focus. If I go ahead and turn off lock and I put my hand up, my hand is now not in focus. But once again, if I turn it off, it'll come in focus super quick. So in continuous autofocus, having this put on a switch is super useful because you can actually lock focus whenever you need it. The last focus mode to talk about is actually AF single, which they just recently added. I actually didn't know they had this until I started testing this, but what I can go ahead and do is I can go ahead and start recording. This is now in focus. If I put my hand up, it's not going to be in focus, but if I half press, what it'll do is it'll put my hand into focus. If I let go, you'll notice that that stays out of focus, but if I half press on the shutter again, it'll automatically come into focus. So single focus does work. The only thing bad about this is that the box doesn't turn green when it's actually active. So when I put my hand up and then all of a sudden I pushed it half push, it'll come into focus, but the box doesn't turn green. So I don't really get a good confirmation. Again, I can half press and then all of a sudden this is in focus right now, but those are the three focus modes that you can use. And it's definitely very useful to actually know how to use each of the focus modes because that's going to help you out when you're actually making your videos. So the last thing that I want to talk about, and honestly it should have been the first thing that I talked about, is the audio. So right there you can actually see the audio picking up. I have my shotgun mic right here hooked up so that it's picking up audio. And what you should really want to do when you first set up your camera is set it up to where it's going to pick up really good audio from whatever mic that you want to use. I would definitely recommend being consistent on the type of mic that you use for your camera. That way your settings can stay consistent. But if you can't do that, you definitely want to check every single time. So you go into the menu settings and then you just keep scrolling down. It's actually on the last page, which means you can just flip over to the last page. Oh, no. It's on page 4. So there's audio settings. If you're going to be using an external mic, what you want to do is you want to look at that. And it's set to manual. I'm just going to be quiet for a second and we can see what the noise floor is, or the bass audio is. So as you can see, when I actually don't say anything, it doesn't pick up any noise. Now for this particular mic, because I'm a little bit further away, what you're trying to look for is you definitely want to be above the green line when you're recording audio, but you can also go a little bit higher so that you can get a little bit closer to the midpoint. The whole point of this is that you want to capture really good audio, but you don't want it reaching all the way to the 0 mark because that could distort your audio. So in this particular setting, I can probably go up a little bit and be perfectly fine. So it's at -3 dB right now. If I be quiet, let's see if I pick up any room noise. So I'm not picking up any room noise, so I can definitely go with a -3. Maybe I can actually get to 0. You can see that at 0, I'm starting to pick up room noise. So I wouldn't want to use 0 because now I'm getting some background hiss. So one more time. So right there is probably the best for this particular setup, which is at -4.5, because I'm not picking up any ambient noise. But when I'm actually talking close to the mic, I'm probably about a foot away. I'm still getting pretty good actually volume. I might actually have to do a little bit post-processing, but you're really gonna have to play with it depending on the mic that you use. But this is definitely one of the things that you want to check on first before you actually start recording your video, because audio is super important. So at this point we are recording. So what I did is I went ahead and locked in my exposure. We are at 1/30 of a second. I'll go ahead and talk about that in a second. One of the biggest downsides to shooting this way is that you can't control your shutter. This is something that's really annoying that I wish Fuji will fix, but for the most part, I don't really have a problem with it. But specifically, I shoot in 4K 30, which means I technically want to have my shutter speed at 1/60 of a second. That's the most common shutter speed for 30 frames per second. If you were to shoot at 24 frames per second, then 1/50 of a second would be the most common shutter speed, basically a doubling of the frames that you're shooting at. And one thing that I do definitely want to stress is that it is the most common. It is not a written rule. You don't have to do it that way, but it is the most common way people shoot, especially if you're going into the more professional cinematography, which is something that you might want to follow. But for me, for YouTube videos, this is not something that I find to be a big issue. In fact, for me, what I have found out is that most people really can't tell the difference between 1/30 of a second all the way up to like 1/250 of a second. They just don't notice because they've watched so many YouTube videos. And trust me, on YouTube, it's all across the entire band, because there are a lot of people that shoot video out there that don't really care about their shutter speed. And for the most part, it really doesn't bother most people. We are at ISO 1250, which is what the camera selected, which is a perfectly fine ISO. As long as you stay under 3200, your video is going to come out really nice. Now, if you didn't understand anything, or if you want me to go into a little bit more detail, definitely leave it in the comments below and I'll be glad to answer them. Hopefully that helps you out, and I will see you in the next video.